So first, in order to perform a customization, we need to develop a gap analysis, and that really involves identifying what the difference is between the baseline system and the customization required. We see this sometimes in a payroll department, so baseline systems may process payroll in certain standardized ways, but perhaps an organization has sophisticated and complicated union contracts that call for all types of hourly or salary differentials based on the shift worked, the type of work being done, the department and the organization that the person is working, just all kinds of different unique mixtures of the calculation of payroll. This is a good example of where customization may be needed. But again, in order to perform this, we need to understand, well, what will the system do or calculate on a baseline method, and then how do we take that from the baseline to the customized requirement. We can go about that in two different ways. One is this idea of Big Bang, and one is an idea of stages. So, and we get to that again by performing this gap analysis, which is again determining the gap between the available baseline systems and the customization that a particular enterprise requires. All right, the Big Bang approach involves going live with all modules of an enterprise system at the same time. And so there we essentially are saying that we go about implementing the baseline system, or developing the baseline system for implementation and developing our customizations for implementation, but we don't implement and execute the system until all of those are available at the same time. And then we take this Big Bang approach where we cut off the old system and turn on the new system. Or we go about this in a way which we refer to as stages, where we typically focus on one module at a time. So we'll select one module, perhaps it's the payroll model, we'll do our gap analysis on that, we'll customize it, and we'll implement it. And then we'll choose another module and go about it the same way. So you can see that it's this phased in or stage approach. And there's no answer that's correct to how we do this, whether it's Big Bang or stages. There are a lot of variables and factors that go into the decision, but ultimately it boils down to a team decision about which method seems most desirable under the circumstances, and then getting senior level buy-in and then proceeding down that path. And so here we see this idea about a gap analysis just being simply the difference between the baseline system and the customization required. So flowcharting and BPMN, which we talked about in our last session, these diagrams can be used to document customization for an accounting system, just as if we were documenting the baseline system. The data flow diagrams, which we discussed in Chapter 4 also, and the UML diagrams can also be used to document customization for a system. Flowchart diagrams can be used to document customization for our system, and we see here the different symbols, and you should recognize this slide from before, the different symbols that are used in flowcharting. And again, it's a very once we've gotten the hang of it, it's a simple approach to doing this customization, but sometimes it's not detailed or provide enough information for our IT department to facilitate the customization. So we often have to execute lower levels of flowcharts or different process diagramming methods. And those different process diagramming methods might be something like the BPMN model that we talked about. And that's what we have here. And you should also recognize, again, these symbols from the BPMN approach to diagramming a process. And again, we use the same approach in developing what it is we require the system to do, or what our process is that we expect the system to facilitate and support, whether it's a baseline process approach or whether we're developing customizations to that baseline. So with respect to customization, we start with the baseline system. And then here we can see, you've seen this before, we have our baseline system and we've identified the different cycles, we identified the different functional areas that the baseline system covers, and so we know what our starting point is. And then we have to decide, well, how do we then customize this? So each of the processes in the sales cycle that we see here will be expanded on and customized using Flowchart and BPMN diagrams. But again, we start with the business baseline system functionality and build from there. So for example, the create invoices process is customized for this EspressoCoffee company using a flowchart. Note that the database tables generally are not shown in these flowcharts. So also the create invoice process is customized for EspressoCoffee using the BPMN approach. So notice too that the database tables shown here are shown in greater detail than in the database tables section. The customer receives payment and process can be expanded and customized for this EspressoCoffee company. The received customer payment processes can be expanded and customized again. The Make Deposits flowchart for EspressoCoffee has two processes: process make deposits and update accounts. And again, so you can see here we're just using the simplified flowchart to illustrate the make deposits process. And so here we use the BPMN approach to the make deposits process. So, and you'll notice the 4 database tables that are used to store the tables in the data swim lane of the EspressoCoffee process flow. So for the purchasing cycle, we look again at, well, how do we then customize the purchasing cycle? And the purchasing cycle includes the create purchase orders, receive items, enter bills, and pay bills. And so this is the flowchart to customize the create purchase orders process for EspressoCoffee. And we can see it contains 6 activities. And those are the check inventory levels, the process purchase order, review purchase order for authorization. We then reach a decision module where we have to decide, well, is the purchase order ready for authorization? If yes, we authorize the purchase order. If no, the arrow going down, we have to resolve the issue. Then we process the purchase order and we generate the purchase order. And so here's that same process if we use BPMN. And so again, you see we are successively building out the detail as we go from flowcharting to BPMN. But because we're successively providing more detail, you can see how this process flow might be more useful to the IT department than the higher level, less detailed one we just looked at. Because here we see we contain 7 activities. And we also see that here we've identified the data that is used throughout these activities in the data swim lane at the bottom of the slide. So this is the process or the flowchart to customize the receive items process for EspressoCoffee, and we see it contains how many activities? And I hope you answered 3. That's to records items received, do items received match purchase order, and if they do, generate the receiving report. If they don't resolve the discrepancies, then generate the receiving reports. So the BPMN here that we see reflected here represents the customization of the received process, and it contains 6 activities. And we also see the data in the data swim lane at the bottom of the page. And so here we see the flowchart to record or to for the business process of entering items, right? And so notice that EspressoCoffee uses a 3-way match when processing or entering items. That is, compares the billed received to the PO and the receiving report. And so how many activities do we have here? And again, I hope you answered 3. And then I asked, well, what is the decision point here? And I'm hoping that you're asking or answering, it's the diamond-shaped symbol where does bill match purchase order and receiving report? And if no, we have to resolve discrepancies, and if yes, we record the bill. And this is the customization to the enter items process flow, and it contains how many activities? And hopefully you answered 5 there. And again, we see the data, we see the tables that are used in the process in the data swim lane. Another flow chart that expresses the pay bills activities. So we verify the funds are available. We select the bills to pay, generally based on some due date. We initiate the electronic funds transfer. We confirm that it goes through. If it did not, we have to resolve discrepancies until it does. And when it does, we notify the vendor of the EFT and we update our accounts. And that's the high-level process flow to this. But if we take that and expand on it, like the BPMN does, we'll see this flow chart or this presentation. And so here again we see the data in the data swim lane, and we see that it's the same general type of flow of information, that we had in our earlier, more simplified, higher level flow charts, but where we identify a few more items, and that's the tables, the data used, and we also, you'll notice down there, we incorporate the vendor swim lane into this, and the bank swim lane into this representation, and it just shows a more complete holistic picture. So if we're looking at then how we customize payroll, there are 4 processes in the payroll cycle that are customized. We enter time, calculate payroll, pay employees, and then pay payroll liabilities. Again, our flow chart with 2 activities. We collect the time worked and we calculate the time worked for payroll processing. And we can see this is very high level, and it really provides us with little insight, even from an accounting perspective, on the process flow of this payroll cycle and the how we achieve the objective of collecting time, processing payroll, and then paying the employees. The BPMN provides us with a little more information in that we then assign the employee swim lane to show that the employee logs on to enter time, which is different from, it's more detailed, and it could require customization of the baseline system, but they enter their time. They enter their time, which accesses employee data in the data swim lane, and also updates time in the timetable in the data swim lane. Then the time entered by the employee is retrieved by the accounting department in the accounting swim lane. We calculate the time for payroll purposes, which then also updates the timetable, and the process is over. But again, you can see how we may have customized this a little differently from the original flowchart to include that the employee logs on and enters their own time. Similarly, we see the flow chart for how we calculate payroll. So we calculate gross pay, total hours times hourly rate. We calculate the withholdings based on the different tax forms that are filed and the different tax regulations. We calculate the net difference, obviously being the difference between the gross pay and the withholdings. We review the payroll for authorization. There's a decision box or a decision parameter that has to be met. Is it correct or not? We then authorize the payroll, and we're at the end of the calculate payroll flowchart. Very high level. So here, what we're doing in order to accomplish this same objective is that we notice that the calculate gross pay is initiated by a computer-based schedule. The calculate payroll process is scheduled to start a specific day and time, such as 8 a.m. on the first of each month. Also notice that the authorization of payroll is provided by the accountant. And so, because that's in the accounting swim lane. And again, so we see our data tables, which are identified here, which we didn't have in the prior flowchart method. So now we're at the pay employees phase or stage, and we can see that we have this the high-level flowchart. We process the payroll payment, and we reach a decision once we process the payroll payment. Is the employee direct deposit, where we're going to deposit it directly into their account, or do we have to cut a check for them? If we deposit it, so if it's yes, employee direct deposit, we're going to process the direct deposit and it will just automatically be deposited into their bank account or accounts. If it's no, that means we have to print a paycheck. If we print a paycheck, we skip the process direct payment process or deposit and go straight to the end. Again, high level flowchart. The pay employees BPMN diagram contains 5 activities, and so that we note that the number of processes are more than in the corresponding flowchart because the BPMN is in more detail. We're essentially doing the same thing. This is the same process. We just expanded it to include additional elements. So the payroll liabilities flowchart is comprised of 5 activities, which include process payroll liabilities, review payroll liabilities for authorization, resolve an issue if one exists, authorize the payroll liabilities, and then remit payment for payroll liabilities. So think about what this would look like before we move on to the next slide, which is the BPMN of this. But you can understand how we would expect there to be a more complicated or detailed presentation of this process. And so on, we'll move on to that slide now. So again, you can see we've broken this process down into areas of responsibility. So there's a bank swim lane, there's an EspressoCoffee swim lane divided into an accounting swim lane and data swim lane, which provides the data tables used. And we have a tax agency swim lane. So we have more detail, which provides greater insight, which might make this more useful to the IT department with respect to the development of this process. And then finally, we talk about the customizing the financial cycle, and we note that the financial cycle includes adjusting entries, correcting entries, closing activities, and then other activities that are necessary with respect to closing the books on some regular routine basis and issuing financial statements. And some or all of these different areas, adjusting, correcting, closing, and others, may or may not be included in the baseline. So we need to perform our gap analysis to decide what we need to customize. And so here we're just showing a comparison between a flowchart of that process, adjusting entries, right, and a BPMN of the same flowchart. So take just a few seconds to look at those and see if you can decide and explain to yourself what the differences are and why. And then finally, the adjusting entries are recorded using an on-screen journal such as the one shown here. And we recall from Chapter 3 that this on-screen journal is a part of the accounting interface and is created using a database form. So you can see that using this form to create the journal entry generally is much easier than going into the system directly and creating a journal entry, because there are some items in here that are pre-populated and that don't lend themselves to miskeying, inaccuracy, or costly duplication of efforts. And so that concludes our discussion of Chapter 5. Again, please go back and read the chapter and make sure you're comfortable with this. It's important to understand that the differences between flowcharting and BPMN, obviously, how one is more useful and why, to what functional areas, and to understand some of the steps involved in these business processes so that when you are thinking about the design and you're thinking about payroll, we think about it more than just paying an employee with a check. It really emanates from the collection of time. It includes the calculation of payroll taxes. It includes calculation of gross pay. It includes the payment of tax liabilities. And it includes the actual payment to the employees. What we didn't see here, and what is also important in that, is how does the payroll cycle and all of those processes then integrate with the job costing system, perhaps, and for example, or the human resource management system. And so there are a lot of implications, details, and complexities associated with this. And so give that some thought too. And please go back and reread the chapter or read the chapter, and don't let this presentation substitute for that. And I look forward to discussing Chapter 6 with you. Thank you.